and thank you all for joining us. Welcome to our monthly webinar series. I'm Anna Popovich, Program Director at Humanist Canada, and I will be moderating today's conversation as always. This webinar will be 60 minutes in length with about 15 to 20 minutes allocated to questions at the end of the presentation. If you have a question and would like to ask it directly, please raise your hand at the bottom of the screen. You can also submit your question or comment with the Q&A tool as well at the bottom of the screen anytime throughout the presentation. And just a reminder that this webinar will be recorded. Today, we will be talking about the present, past, and future of low-cost housing in Canada, and I'm delighted to welcome our guest speaker, Sarah Cooper. Sarah is an assistant professor in the Department of City Planning in the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Manitoba. Her research focuses on housing and social policy with an emphasis on ensuring access to housing for all. Her current research examines housing for low-income households in Canada with a focus on the expiry of social housing funding agreements, an issue that will transform the landscape of housing and housing policy in Canada over the next few decades. Prior to completing her PhD at the University of Illinois in Chicago, Sarah worked as a research associate and planner at the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources in Winnipeg, and as a researcher at the Manitoba office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. She has worked on a wide variety of research and planning projects, including neighborhood housing plans, watershed and community plans, and housing and social policy analyses. Sarah is also a registered professional planner and member of the Canadian Institute of Planners. So glad to have you join us, Sarah. Thank you so much, and over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna, for inviting me to be here today. And thank you to everybody who is joining us today. Happy that you're all able to take some time out of this Sunday afternoon, which I guess has variable weather across the country. So let me just share my slides. And Anna, please let me know. I think I fixed the problem, but please let me know if there are still issues.
Sure.
So can you see the slides? Does it look good?
Yep.
All right. So I was asked to talk about housing in Canada, and I'm going to focus mostly on low-cost housing. So I'll begin with some basic concepts to make sure we're all on the same page, then delve into the history of low-cost housing policy in Canada, and then consider some possibilities for the future. So let me start by introducing myself. I'm a first-generation settler Canadian, and my family comes from England and Ireland. I grew up in Toronto, but now I live in Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory. And Treaty 1 was signed in 1871 by the Crown with 7 Anishinaabe and Cree nations. And Winnipeg is also the homeland of the Métis Nation. I teach in city planning at the University of Manitoba, and my main research interests are housing, with social planning in particular, and social justice and equity in planning, as well as Indigenous planning and planning in a colonial context. So let's delve into some basic concepts in housing. Core housing need it's actually a Canadian concept. It's not used so much in other parts of the world, but I think it's a very useful one because it's not just about the affordability of housing, but it also takes into account the quality of the housing and the size of the housing. So a household is said to be in core housing need if its housing is not adequate. So if it's in poor condition and maybe it needs major repairs. If it's not suitable, so the housing should be appropriate for the household size and makeup, so the size of the family or the number of people who are living there. And then also it should be affordable. It should cost 30% or less of the household gross income. And that's kind of a benchmark that Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation uses to assess affordability of housing. So the chart on the right shows core housing need from 1991 to 2016. And the orange line shows the percentage of households, which has mostly gone down since its peak in 1996. The blue line, on the other hand, shows the actual number of households in core housing need. And you can see that that one has increased over time, even as the percentage of people in core housing need has decreased. And this is because the total number of people in the country has increased over time. So there's a smaller percentage, but the smaller percentage is still a larger number of people. So that's people who are actively in core housing need. But a household can also be considered precariously housed if it's at risk of homelessness, and that can happen for a variety of reasons. But in 2019, Ipsos, the people who do surveys, they found that 48% of Canadians are $200 or less away from financial insolvency. And that means that these households might be at risk of homelessness if there's a crisis that interrupts their income. So they may be well housed at the moment, but they may be, like a couple of months away from a risk of homelessness if there's an interruption or a life crisis, whatever it is that interrupts income. So what are the factors that affect this idea of core housing need? First of all, there's affordability. Is there housing that's actually affordable to the household in the area that it wants to live in? Related to that is the idea or the fact of income. So a household has a given amount of income. Is there actually housing available that is going to meet that income threshold? So slightly different things, right? Affordability is sort of more on the market side. How much does the housing cost? Whereas income is on the household side. How much can the household actually afford? Then, of course, back to income for a second. That also includes access to financing. So households have different kinds of access to financing, whether that's a mortgage, payday loans, any kind of finance that might help to contribute to covering the cost of housing. And then households do experience discrimination based on class, income, source of income, race or ethnic origin, gender, number of children, all those kinds of factors. And especially for tenants, this can be a really big issue in trying to find housing. Then tenants, or well, anybody who's looking for housing has to consider whether there's actually housing available that meets their needs in the area they're looking for. So if they have particular accessibility needs, is there housing available that'll do that? Is there housing that's the right size for the family? Often people who have especially large households have trouble finding large housing to match that size of their household. Although in some rural areas as well, individuals may have trouble finding, a one-bedroom unit if most of the housing is developed for large families. So it kind of goes both ways. And then quality, is there actually available housing that is good quality? Also shaped by people's capacity to find and maintain housing. For many people, that's not a big issue, but some people do need extra supports in order to maintain their housing over the long term. All of these factors and the housing market itself, or the provision of housing itself, are shaped by municipal, provincial, and federal policies. And then also, of course, non-government entities like landlords, financial institutions, insurance agents, real estates, all of these different kinds of actors have a say on the kinds of housing that people can access. So what does core housing need actually look like in Canada? The most recent numbers that I could find on core housing need are from 2018. And of course, they've probably changed since then, especially with the complications of the COVID pandemic and all of that. But it's unlikely that they've radically improved. So we'll go with these for the moment, just take them with a grain of salt. So among off-reserve households in Canada, 11.6%, or about 1,645,000, are in core housing need. And those are households, right? Not individuals, it's households. So usually more, well, not necessarily usually, but often more than one person. And that's just over 1 in 10 households who don't have access to good quality, appropriately sized, affordable housing. Now, if you break it down between renters and owners, it's a little bit different. The proportion of renters in core housing need is much higher at 23%, or almost 1 in 4 renter households. And among owner households, on the other hand, only about 6.5% of households are in core housing need. And the reason for that is that on average, owners have incomes that are twice as high as renters. So they have more financial capacity, more options, more opportunities for making those kinds of choices. Sorry, did I get through everything there? Yes. Okay. So when we look, those numbers were for Canada, but when we look more locally, we can see a different picture because, of course, there's substantial variation in housing need across the country. So I'm looking at Toronto and Winnipeg because they're quite different cities. But of course, for those of you who are from other parts of the country, you may find that your local core housing need numbers are different from these. So in Toronto, 18.7% of households are in core housing need, which breaks down to 29% of renter households, or almost 1 in 3 paying, over 30% of their income in rent, and 11.3% of owner households, or just over 1 in 10. And in Winnipeg, on the other hand, 12.4% of all households are in core housing need, with 26% or 1 in 4 renter households and 5.1% of owner households. Now, my talk today is focusing mostly on off-reserve housing, but I did want to also highlight the high need for housing on First Nations. So in 2020, the First Nations Information Governance Center and the Assembly of First Nations published the results of a survey of First Nations across Canada. And they found that 75% of elders lodges, senior housing, and other supportive housing on reserve needed replacing, and 50% of single detached houses on reserve also needed to be replaced. The report also highlighted the importance or the concern of overcrowding and in-house access to good drinking water across the country. So the point of all of these numbers is that there are many, many households across Canada for whom housing is an urgent day-to-day concern. So let's talk about some of the ways that Canada has addressed housing need in the past. And for that, we need to go back to this idea of the social safety net. So since the Second World War, Canada has had a number of different ways of addressing housing need and other kinds of socioeconomic problems. But from the 1950s to the 1990s, the main solution to housing need was to build and fund long-term, non-market, public, nonprofit, and cooperative housing. And in fact, for decades, Canada's social housing programs were recognized around the world as models for low-cost housing provision. These social housing programs were part of the social safety net, which arose after the Great Depression of the 1930s and the Second World War, alongside Keynesian economics. So the social safety net idea recognized that capitalism is inherently unstable and that something is needed to protect individuals from the inevitable failures of capitalism. So social housing developed alongside programs like healthcare, unemployment insurance, the Canada Pension Plan, old age security, and other universal programs funded through taxes to achieve a basic standard of living for all citizens. Now, this is not to say that these programs were perfect, because they were not, but they were an innovative way to create collective solutions to society-wide needs, and they continue to be relevant today because of how they make it possible in a capitalist system for people to be able to make choices about their lives. So for example, they make it possible for people to choose to not work, for example, if they're sick or if they're old and want to retire, so that they don't have to continue to sell their labor just to stay alive and stay housed. And they made it possible for people to make choices about their lives outside of the market. So let's start talking about social housing by talking about the difference between market and non-market housing. About 95% of households in Canada access housing through the market. And for most of these households, the market works okay. Maybe not great, but okay. But as we've seen, there are millions of households in Canada for whom the market is not working so well. So when the market doesn't provide housing for a certain group, it's called a market failure, and housing policy is meant to address this gap in a variety of different ways. So what is market housing? Market housing includes both rental and owner-occupied housing. About 65% of households in Canada own their housing and about 35% rent. It's housing that can be used for speculation or for financial gain. For example, we've seen the TV shows about house flippers. There's also, slumlords in the rental market. There are real estate investment trusts. Basically, the owner can use the equity in the property by mortgaging it, by renting it out, by selling it, and thus, either use it for accommodation to live in or to make a profit from. And two really common types of market property that you're likely familiar with are fee simple ownership, which is how most people who own their homes, that's how they own it, and condo ownership. These days, market housing is increasingly commodified and financialized. So what do I mean by that? Commodified housing is housing that, instead of being used primarily for accommodation or as a place to live, it's increasingly traded as a commodity and used for speculation and financial gain. So this happens not only by buying and selling a property directly, but also by turning mortgages and rental properties into financial commodities that can be traded globally in financial markets. And we heard about this a lot in 2007 with the global economic crisis and the meltdown of mortgage markets in the United States. That was a case of mortgages being packaged into these financial, packets that could be then traded on a very high level. And the result is that investors who may not have any local connection to a property may be seeking a higher rate of return on their investment and creating pressure in local markets where the local people living there may not be able to afford the increasing cost of housing. So on the other hand, non-market housing is housing that is intentionally removed from the market so that it can't be used for speculation. Its intent is to really focus on housing as accommodation and to keep it outside the market to protect that use. So in order to do that, it has limits on what can be done with the equity in the property. Usually it has some kind of regulation to stop financial gain, to stop speculation, and that might be something like a pricing formula, a maximum sale or rent price. It might have a legal mechanism to keep the pricing formula in place over the long term, and it might have an administrative structure to enforce the restrictions on price. So public, nonprofit, and cooperative housing are the most common forms of non-market housing here in Canada, but you may have also heard of community land trusts or restrictions on deeds. Those are other types of ways of keeping housing out of the market as well. So it's important to understand the difference between market and non-market housing, because although social housing gets talked about a lot, it gets a lot of attention. In fact, most government policy and funding supports market housing, and increasingly many Canadian homeowners are relying on increases in the value of their property to fund retirements, to fund their lifestyles, all that kind of stuff. So if we go back to the 1950s and 1960s, to the early days of public housing, I think that'll illustrate some of what I'm talking about with the non-market housing side of things. Low-cost housing development started in Canada before the Second World War. There were a few small-scale projects here and there, but it really kicked off with the 1949 National Housing Act, which made it possible for the federal government to fund low-cost housing projects at a much larger scale. So the first projects were public housing, which is housing that's owned and operated by a government. Today, public housing is mostly owned by the provincial governments, except in Ontario, where it's been, what's the term for it, downloaded to municipal or regional government structures. But in the 1950s and 60s, public housing was usually federally funded in partnership with municipalities. So a lot of, or most of, the early public housing construction was based in concerns about slums and the perceived need to eliminate slums and reduce overcrowding and homelessness. Urban renewal projects resulted in large areas of a city being cleared and then replaced with public housing. Initially, the projects were often intended for returning veterans or for employed working class families, but over the next few decades, the population of public housing shifted and moved increasingly to single parent families and families on welfare. In other words, households living in poverty. The result was a concentrated poverty with all the complications and challenges that go along with that. So as public housing became more and more housing of last resort for households that were struggling with poverty and all those complications, it began to be stigmatized by the broader public. Although many public housing complexes were and continue to be good places to live, public pressure pushed the federal government to come up with a different way of addressing housing needs. The government solution was to offer funding to local groups, local organizations, including unions, service and cultural organizations, and faith-based groups, to develop nonprofit and cooperative housing for their local community. So nonprofit housing providers are organizations that own and operate low-cost housing, or in some cases, they operate housing that's owned by the province. Tenants who live in nonprofit housing usually pay an affordable rent, which is one that is at or below median market rents, and which may also be deeply subsidized. Cooperatives have a little bit of a different structure. They're owned and operated by the member residents, so the people who are living in the housing collectively own all the housing and make decisions about it together. So there are a whole lot of different kinds of housing co-ops, but the ones funded through the federal programs from the 1970s and 80s are zero equity, which means that the member owners don't have any equity in the property, and they, like the nonprofit organizations, received funding from the governments to make the housing affordable to low and moderate income households. So these two programs, the nonprofit and co-op housing programs, it was a very successful approach. The federal government, often in partnership with the provincial government, would provide capital and operating funds to a local group who would then build and manage the housing. Thousands of housing projects were created across the country with substantial variety in size, geography, target population. The nonprofit housing that resulted from these programs includes housing for families, seniors, people with various mental or physical health issues, single parents, and other demographics. And one program that continues to be especially important was the Urban Native Housing Program, where local Indigenous organizations provide housing for Indigenous households whose experience of housing need is often more than just a need for 4 walls and a roof, but it extends to housing that addresses and supports Indigenous ways of life. So I mentioned that sometimes the units in nonprofit and co-op housing are deeply subsidized. So in many cases, nonprofits and co-ops received unit-based subsidies to enable what are called rents geared to income, or RGI rents. You may have heard this term before. This is when a tenant pays a rent that is based on 25 to 30% of their income, rather than on what it costs to provide the unit or a market rent. So this is a deep subsidy that comes to the nonprofit organization or the co-op and makes it possible for them to house very low income households who may not be able to afford the cost of what it actually costs to provide the housing unit. And this is the approach that became recognized around the world because of its local focus, its strong community-based approach, and the long-term funding structure that kept it outside the market and therefore kept it affordable. So that was the 1970s and 80s. Then in 1993, the Liberal government of the day cut funding for new off-reserve social housing development. Just cut it, stop, nothing more. Funding for ongoing subsidies continued, but there was no funding for new social housing. At the time, many provincial governments across the country cut funds for social programs, including welfare and income assistance programs. So this, combined with steadily low private market rental housing construction, especially at the affordable end of the spectrum, left many low-income households with fewer and fewer housing options. So between 1993 and 2001, very, very little new social housing was built. And in 2001, it was recognized that this approach was really not working. People were having trouble maintaining and accessing housing, and housing need was increasing. So the federal government began to provide funding again through the Affordable Housing Initiative, as well as some other smaller programs. But these programs didn't come close to meeting the need for affordable quality housing for low-income households, and they didn't include the long-term subsidies that are needed to ensure long-term affordability. So instead, we ended up with what scholars have called a patchwork of programs that operate differently across the country, depending on the province in which they're housed, the region, all that kind of stuff. So the programs, which are short-term, don't have those, as I mentioned, the long-term funding guarantee that enables the housing construction and subsidies. But the other thing that started to happen in the early 2000s was that the funding agreements that provided ongoing operating and rent geared to income subsidies to nonprofit and cooperative housing providers, these agreements started to expire. So for many housing providers, this was a shock, as they had expected the government to renew or at least continue to support in some way the low-cost housing that they were providing. And instead, the then conservative government said, the government has fulfilled its commitment and the funding will end at the end of the mortgage of the agreement. Basically, it was saying that housing providers were on their own, with the implication that hundreds of thousands of rent geared to income units would be lost. And you can see this on the chart here in the screen, where the blue bars show the units of housing covered by expiring operating agreements. The last one, excuse me, the last one to the right end of the screen is expiring in 2040. And the red bars show the number of rent geared to income units that will be lost as the agreements expire. So that's a growing number. And we'll come back to this because there has been a partial solution to this problem. So we'll come back to this. But this history so far brings us up to 2017. There's been little low-cost housing development in Canada since 1993, and in fact, since the early 2000s, federal funding agreements for low-cost housing have been expiring. So this, combined with reductions in social assistance, slow wage growth, and increases in rent and house prices, have resulted in a situation where many households are increasingly feeling a crunch. So what happened in 2017? In 2017, Canada released the National Housing Strategy. And this was, of course, I've totally forgotten his name, Trudeau's government released this in 2017. It was Canada's first national housing strategy. It's a 10-year plan, $40 billion, intended to address many different aspects of Canada's housing system. So it has a broad scope. It has programs to address home ownership. It has programs to address renting. It has programs to address community housing. And it also takes a gender-based lens to all kinds of housing issues to ensure that women and children are not excluded from the housing products that are developed through this housing strategy. So in 2019, very soon after the National Housing Strategy was released, the National Housing Strategy Act was passed, which recognized the right to housing in Canada. And this is an important moment because it formally says Canadians have a right to housing. How this actually gets implemented is not clear, but it is there. And it commits the government to continuing to develop and maintain the National Housing Strategy into the future indefinitely. And in order to create accountability for the National Housing Strategy, this National Housing Strategy Act committed to creating a National Housing Council and also appointing a federal housing advocate who would kind of keep an eye on the housing situation. So what is included in the National Housing Strategy? There are some, sort of ambiguous targets. One of them is 530,000 households removed from housing needs. So that's great. But what exactly does it mean that they're removed from housing need? It includes a 50% reduction in the number of chronically homeless shelter users, 100,000 new housing units to be created, 300,000 existing housing units to be repaired and renewed, 300,000 households provided with an affordability supplement through the Canada Housing Benefit, and 385,000 households protected from losing an affordable home. And this last point is important, the 385,000 households protected from losing an affordable home. This refers to the rent geared to income units that I had mentioned a couple slides back that are losing their funding, with the chart with the blue line going down and the red going up as the RGI units lost their funding. So this National Housing Strategy addresses that concern by supporting at least the same number of deeply subsidized units. It's not necessarily promising to support the same units that are currently subsidized, but is protecting the same number of households from losing their affordable home. And this is an important step towards protecting existing social housing, because we don't need to worry so much about, it's not that we don't need to worry about, we don't need to focus so much on building more if we also protect what we already have, right? And we don't want to be losing what we already have. So how is all of this going to happen? There's a $16 billion National Housing Co-Investment Fund, which will create up to 60,000 units of housing and repair up to 240,000 units. There's $4.3 billion to support community housing providers, with the requirement that the overall number of households currently supported by community housing in their province or territory will not be reduced. And I should note that community housing is what the National Housing Strategy calls social housing providers. So that means the nonprofits and the co-ops. There's funding for northern and territorial housing. There's funding for research and demonstration projects. There's improved access to home ownership through mortgage loan insurance, and some focus on changing laws to prevent speculation in hot markets. There are supposed to be 3 distinctions-based Indigenous housing strategies. So First Nations strategy, Inuit strategy, and Métis strategy. I believe the Inuit and Métis housing strategies have been launched, but I think the First Nation strategy is still being developed. I haven't heard anything about that in a while. And then the other part of this is the Canada Housing Benefit, which is being rolled out across the country slowly, and it's coming up differently in different provinces. But I wanted to flag this one because it's a very different way of addressing housing need than the social housing programs of the past. But it's one that's increasingly popular. So it's good to note that it's coming up because it's going to be a more common approach in the future. So instead of a supply side program where government funds support the construction and management of low cost housing, as we've seen in the past with public, nonprofit, and cooperative housing programs, the Canada Housing Benefit and other programs like it offer a subsidy directly to tenants. So the tenants can take their subsidy and they can use it wherever they want to find housing. So they can move to a nonprofit or they can move to a private market housing, whatever works for them. So the benefit of this is it gives renters more flexibility, but it also acts as a subsidy to private landlords without necessarily requiring any accountability on their part to provide good quality housing. And it also doesn't address the needs of households that may need additional supports to find and maintain housing. So how is the National Housing Strategy going so far? It was launched in November 2017. It's now 2022, so we're about 4 and a bit years in. And there was a report that was released just in February of this year that analyzed the 3 biggest funding programs under the National Housing Strategy. So these are the Rental Construction Financing Initiative, the National Housing Co-Investment Fund, and the Rapid Housing Initiative. So far, these programs have approved $8.3 billion in loans and $2 billion in grants. They'll repair about 66,000 units and create just under 35,000 units of new housing. Most of this new housing is affordable, but it's not really affordable to those who are in the deepest need. And even if all of these new units were affordable to fill or to the lowest income households, the numbers being created are still not enough to lift households out of core housing need. So there is progress happening, but maybe not enough, maybe not quickly enough. But I do want to highlight the constantly changing nature of this the housing policy sector these days, which is that there's some hope arising from the recently announced this past week NDP Liberal deal. So this is brand new news. In exchange for the NDP support for the Liberal minority government, the Liberals have agreed to address these points in relation to housing. Now, they're also dealing with some other things. There's a dental plan and I don't remember the other details, but in terms of housing, the NDP has asked the Liberals, and the Liberals have agreed to extend the Rapid Housing Initiative for another year, refocus some financing on affordable units, use 80% median or below as a definition of affordable housing, moving forward on Housing Accelerator Fund, implementing a Home Buyers Bill of Rights, including a top up to the Canada Housing Benefit, and making an additional investment in Indigenous housing in 2022. And so that is all still being worked out as to how that'll actually be implemented and what it'll actually look like. But this is interesting because minority governments are often a time when, or an opportunity for the NDP, which does not usually, never has gotten elected to the federal government, but it's a way that the NDP can push some of its policies forward. And most recently that happened in 2008, I think it was, when Jack Layton was the leader of the NDP, and he made a coalition, no, it wasn't a coalition government, but he partnered with the Harper government at the time and managed to get $2 billion set into low-cost housing development at the time. So these minority governments provide interesting opportunities sometimes for these kinds of conversations to happen in relation to housing. So where are we at with housing? We've looked at the history of housing policy in Canada, from the public housing of the 1960s to the nonprofit and cooperative housing programs of the 1970s and 80s, to the end of new funding for social housing in 1993, and then the National Housing Strategy in 2017. So that brings us up to today. So as you can see, there's a lot going on right now in housing policy. The National Housing Strategy is still unfolding. The recent NDP Liberal deal is still kind of brand new. And so it remains to be seen what's going to happen. But here are a few considerations. So we're still seeing this disappearing social safety net. There's still an increasing focus on individual responsibility for solving the systemic problems that are created by capitalism. Housing is increasingly commodified. It's treated as a means of increasing wealth rather than as a tool for accommodation. The focus is increasingly on market-oriented solutions. So for example, by building housing in the private market and providing tenants with subsidies to access housing in the market, instead of just building non-market housing. And existing social housing is more important than ever as housing that has a mandate and subsidies to provide low-cost housing, but it's also vulnerable as government subsidies and supports shift to focus more on market solutions. Now, on the other hand, I don't want to end on a down note, so here are some reasons for optimism. In 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, the federal government leapt into action and provided all kinds of resources to keep people housed. There was funding to house people experiencing homelessness in hotels. There was support for women's shelters and transitional housing, and the CERB, or the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, which was widely used as people lost jobs and wages because of the pandemic, was a huge investment in Canada's stability and security during the pandemic. As a bit of an aside, the poverty rate for children decreased 4.7 percentage points in 2020, reducing the number of children in poverty for that year by 50%. And that's mostly because of CERB, because many households, their incomes actually increased as they were no longer relying on unstable, low-paying jobs. So this shows that when there is political will, governments can address socioeconomic problems. And I think there's also increasing awareness and concern among Canadian society about the impacts of poverty, including housing need and housing precarity. There's also growing concern about potential crises like future pandemics or the growing climate crisis. And fixing socioeconomic problems before the next crisis hits will leave us in a better position to address that crisis. So what's needed is government investment and policy support. And we do see that happening, albeit slowly, with the National Housing Strategy. And hopefully the NDP Liberal deal may move that forward a bit faster. So I will end here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to any conversation and questions.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks so much for your presentation and all the rich data that you have shared with us. So if you have any questions, I do see there's a question. If you have questions, please raise your hand. You can see the hand tool at the bottom of your screen, or you can use the Q&A toolbox to submit a question in a written form. And so the first question is, we increasingly recognize that most of us live on unceded Indigenous land, but as of yet, I have not received any claim from these people for a rent for the land I live on. Can't we all pay for the land we live on? It could be collected by municipal tax collectors.
Yeah, I just read something the other day, and I'm trying to remember where it was, but it was a municipality in Canada. I want to say maybe it was Victoria, BC, but I'm not sure. But there was a municipality that had just established a process by which people could contribute to a local fund that, like, as part of their property taxes, and it would go to the local First Nations. And I really wish I could remember where it was, because it was super interesting. But yeah, you're totally right. That is not something that happens very often. That's the first case that I know of, and it's definitely an issue. I think, you know, paying rents is one option. Another option is asking your government representatives to return land to First Nations. There have been a number of examples across Canada of either co-governance. There are some municipalities and some federal parks that have found ways to collaborate between the Canadian municipality and the local First Nation to find ways to work together. So that might be an option, to reach out to your local government and see what they're doing in terms of that, because I do agree that is a big concern.
Thanks, Sarah. Next question. I heard that BC has not accessed very much of the new federal national housing strategy funding. Is this true? And do you know why that would be?
I don't know the details about each province's funding agreements. The way that the funding works for the national housing strategy is that the federal government puts in a certain amount and the province has to match it. And that has been settled, that's been negotiated between each province and the federal government by creating a bilateral agreement. So it would be whatever is included in the bilateral agreement for each province would be what is coming from the federal government. But unfortunately, I don't know the details about each different province.
A question from Steve. I lived in co-op housing in Toronto in the 90s. I paid full price in a building where there was a mix of market priced and rent geared to income. It was brilliant, a real community. No landlord to have to plead with, an elected board that ran things. In your opinion, why can't this model be revived?
Yeah, that's a good question. So co-op housing is interesting because not all of the co-op housing in Canada emerged from the programs that I'm talking about, right? Co-op housing is its own kind of model that has been created in different ways in different parts of the country at different times. The federal government's funding created zero equity housing, which is different. And I'll give you an example to kind of explain what I mean. So most of the housing that was created, or the co-op housing that was created in the 70s and 80s is housing that was funded. It got funding for capital, like building the actual buildings, and then some operating grants to help it operate to keep rents or keep the housing charges low. More recently in Winnipeg, like in the last 10 years, a group of people got together and started their own co-op, and it's called the Old Grace Housing Co-op. Housing shares to be able to live in the co-op are $100,000. And the reason for that is that there wasn't funding from the government put into it in order to reduce those costs up front. So even though this group of people was really keen to have a mixed income community, they just weren't able, I think maybe they got a little bit of funding to make some of it work, but they weren't able to do it in the same structural way that the programs of the 70s and 80s made possible. So I agree, it definitely should be an ongoing kind of program, because it is a great way for people to live in community, to not be, to have control over their own housing. It's resident managed housing. People can make choices about what they want to happen with the housing. But what's really needed in order to do the same style of housing that was produced in the 70s and 80s is that government funding to help keep the costs down.
Okay, next question. How will these programs transition into provincial and municipal governments? A few years ago, the Ford government reduced the option of chances to choose housing to 1 instead of 3 chances through a social housing registry.
Yeah, okay, so I think there's 2 questions there that I'm going to answer. If you could leave it up on the screen just so I can see it.
For sure.
The first one is, how do these programs transition into provincial governments and municipal governments? So the funding is federal, but the province has to negotiate with the federal government in order to get that money. And so together they figure out how will the money be spent? What will the money look like? And then once the money, or what will the programs look like? What will the housing look like? So once the funding, has actually gone to the provincial level, then it becomes a provincial responsibility. So in the case where you're living, like, let's say in social housing in Toronto, then the province of Ontario, or actually no, the municipality of Toronto, the Toronto Housing Municipality would be responsible for the housing and for the funding. It's not so much the federal government, they're just there for accountability. Okay, second question, or second point, was a few years ago, the Ford government reduced the option of chances to choose housing to 1 instead of 3 through a social housing registry. I don't know the details about Ontario social housing, but I do know the same thing happened in Manitoba. It used to be that if you wanted to live in public housing, in Manitoba housing, you would go and they would give you a few different options, you know, in different communities, different neighborhoods. You could choose where you wanted to live. And since then, they've cut it down to one. And if you don't want to live in, you know, that community or that housing, that particular house doesn't work for you, that's it. Then you don't have another option. And the reason that they did that is because they're trying to reduce the wait list. So the waiting list for public housing in Winnipeg is, I think it's like 5 years long. I think it's even longer in Toronto. I'd imagine many large cities have very long waiting lists.
It's 10 plus years.
10 plus, is it really?
Yes.
Wow. Yeah. So they're trying to reduce that, but at what cost, right? Like, people need to be able to make choices about where they're living. There are reasons why someone might want to live in one area versus another. So yeah, it's definitely, what's needed is more housing.
Okay, are there long-term plans nationally to achieve a certain percentage of non-market housing and social housing, say 20% of the total housing inventory?
Not long-term and not non-market. So the National Housing Strategy has this goal of building up the amount of low-cost housing that's available in Canada. So that means housing that's, well, it depends a little bit on how you measure it. It could be that costs less than 30% of low-income people's rent, or that costs, that the rents are less than 80% of the typical rent for the area. So that's kind of, but there's no specific number that they're aiming for. They're not aiming for 20% or 10% or whatever. They're just, you know, they're just kind of saying, let's build some, and none of it, or not none of it, but very little of it is non-market or social housing, right? It doesn't necessarily come with long-term subsidies. It's not necessarily removed from the market in any significant way unless it's being built by a nonprofit. But a lot of the National Housing Strategy funding is going to for-profit developers who are still building, who are just building like lower than market housing. So it's more affordable, but it doesn't meet the needs of the lowest income households.
So I guess following up on your response, I'll jump to this question. Is the Canadian social housing strategy at all proportionate to the unprecedented spike in housing unaffordability that we're seeing? There seems to be a disconnect where the government seems willfully ignorant of the nature of the crises. It seems that the source of the problem is an over-reliance on market-driven housing as opposed to government-controlled social housing. How can government claw back control from the market? And if I may add my own 2 cents, I was reading in the news about the fact that in 2020, the Ottawa City Councillor declared a housing emergency for Ottawa, right? And so that's 3 years after the National Housing Strategy that was announced that you mentioned in 2017. Right, and so just reading about it, it got my attention that the motion was unanimously passed, and she said in the motion, we've been calling this a crisis for 15 years and nothing has changed, right? Her colleague proposed calling it an ongoing, critical, and urgent crisis rather than an emergency. And of course, if we look at Toronto, and I, you know, as myself, I moved here a few years ago, and it is a crunch, you know, so it was the second most expensive city in Canada to rent in February, according to the National Rent Report, with the average monthly cost for a 1-bedroom at $2,044. So, and as people who live here or recently moved here, like we all know, it's really crazy stuff. Right? It looks like, it sounds like there was never a bubble here. The bubble never got burst, right? As opposed to the US since the global recession. So it's really curious, right? The situation in the Canadian context in cities like Toronto or Vancouver, right? So sorry about the long question, but I did want to, you know, put in my 2 cents on this.
Yeah, no, and actually, hold on a second. I have another slide that I want to pull up. Let me just see. Yeah, I'm just going to share this slide for a second. So you can see here, this shows rents versus incomes. So this is, if you're living, let's pull Toronto up. So here, this is from, I think the rents are 2022 and the incomes are actually like a little bit older. Oh no, they're not. That's how much you would need. So if you're in Toronto, you need $2,000 a month for a 1-bedroom, and you would, in order to be able to accomplish that, you would need $90,000 a year in income. Similarly, if you want to rent a 2-bedroom, $2,700 is the average. So you'd need a gross annual income of $118,000. Now, for the average household, income is not that high. I think it's around $70,000 a year for a household, and then for an individual, it's around $37,000. So if you're trying to, afford a 1-bedroom in Toronto, which is around over $2,000 a month, and your income is $3,500 or $3,700, that's the median, right? Half the people are below that. It's very challenging. So to come back to the question here about the disconnect, yes, there is kind of a disconnect there. It's definitely worse in cities like Toronto and Vancouver, but it's accelerating in other parts of the country as well. Yeah, I would agree that the source of the problem is this over-reliance on market-driven housing, and especially market-driven housing that is relied upon both as an investment product. So people, who are investing, not necessarily like me going out and buying investment properties, but me investing in a real estate investment fund, for example, or a trust. Or buying these financialized packages of mortgages as an investment, and then demanding that I get, a lot of income from it. So it ends up being this very complex situation where housing is no longer seen primarily for accommodation, but it's seen as a financial resource, which also individuals also rely on the housing that they own, right? Like a lot of people are seeing their housing as their retirement package. They're going to sell it and move somewhere else. So I think the government needs political will in order to claw that back, to go back to a non-market kind of option. And to do that, they're going to need to also, that people need to demand that in some ways. I don't think that's really happening a lot of the time, because people see the benefit of their house prices increasing. So why do they, if you're already in the system, you're probably okay looking at your house going up. But if you're trying to get into the system, it's really hard.
And what can people do about this? Sorry, just jumping in on the last point.
This is where
so organize for a change.
Yeah, it's not about individual actions at this point. It's about how do we work together to advocate to our political representatives, our elected officials, to say, here's what we want, and then to get them to go and fix it, right? I think the National Housing Strategy was an attempt to get to that, but the context keeps changing. The pandemic was unexpected. All kinds of factors have come up, and so it needs to be constantly revisited.
Is there a grant for First Nation communities and individuals to work to design housing, for materials, for training people to construct their own housing?
Yeah, so First Nations, so I don't know so much about that kind of housing specifically, but I can tell you like sort of the basics, which are that First Nations are responsible for their own housing, but they receive funding from both CMHC and Indigenous Services Canada in order to develop the housing and maintain it and all of that. So the amount of housing or the amount of funding is not sufficient. And so you're asking, are First Nations finding creative ways to do, training, design, building, all of that? There are programs that are happening. I know of a couple. I know Nisichawayasik Cree Nation, which is Nelson House in Manitoba. They have a program where they've been training youth and young people in the community as electricians, plumbers, carpenters, all these like trades. And there's the young people get, I don't know what the word is, like accreditation, maybe they get the professional apprenticeship kind of credit as they go through this program. And at the same time, they're building housing within their community. And they're looking to expand that beyond just Nishichawayasik to other communities in the area. So that's one example. Because yeah, a lot, especially northern communities, they have wood nearby. They have, you know, resources that could be used to build the housing. But it's a matter of figuring out what's the structure that's going to make that possible.
Okay, what are your thoughts about minimum basic income helping housing to be more affordable for low income Canadians? And I had that very question, exactly that question as well. And also, if in your estimate, what would be the impact of a basic income project on the housing landscape overall, if it were to be implemented?
Yeah, well, so this is an interesting question because in some ways in 2020 with the CERB, with the emergency response benefit due to the pandemic, we kind of got a sense of like, how would a basic minimum income work in Canada, right? Like that's, the government was like, we need something, $2,000 a month. Everyone gets $2,000 a month. That's the minimum. And for a lot of people, that was great. That was more than they were making before. So that was, that showed, as I mentioned, there was that statistic about child poverty in Canada being cut in half in 2020, in large part due to the transfer payments from the federal government. So I think there's a lot of benefits to that. And I also want to point to Manitoba, which has a rent subsidy program, which operates as an income supplement. So there's a program which is available to everybody who's under a certain affordable or certain income threshold that covers the difference between 30% of their income and 80% of the median market rent. And they get that chunk of money, even if they can find a place to live that's cheaper than that. So that's a way of kind of investing in a minimum basic income, but through the lens of housing. There are problems with that program too, but I do think like it's a big connection, right? Once you have enough money to pay for your housing, that frees you up or frees up some of your money for food, for medication, for other basic necessities, because it all comes in the same budget. You can't separate it out. We sort of do with budget lines and that, you know, like, oh, this much for housing, this much for food. But if you're really living on the edge, then you aren't necessarily, you're prioritizing based on what's the most important need that day, not really, you know, based on your spreadsheet. So I think, yeah, the basic income piece is a really important one. And the rent assist program in Manitoba can be a way to kind of start getting towards that through this housing lens. I can talk more about that too if people are interested.
And as a researcher and practitioner, do you yourself support basic income?
Yeah, I would. I think that the one challenge I see with it is that it might end up acting as a subsidy to private employers. You know, so there needs to be a way to make sure that it's not enabling an employer to pay less. But I do think that, you know, housing is so foundational. So is all the things like food and medicine, all those kinds of things. Those are all basic needs that we all need. And everybody should have the right to meet their basic needs no matter what. It shouldn't be a question of whether you have the money or not.
Okay, so we are almost at the top of the hour. So maybe 2 more questions that were in the chat. Many houses are now being purchased as second houses, either a vacation property for rent or to rent. Sorry, Airbnb, for example. Should investment property increased value be taxed as income?
I would argue yes. And I think it is. The capital gains tax exemption for home ownership only applies to the house that you live, your main residence, your primary residence. So I think any additional property would be, if it increased in value, you would have to pay the capital gains tax on that. So I think it already is, but if it's not, it should be.
Okay, the next question was, given the money has to go to the developers for affordable housing, has the government, local, federal, lost control of the land? And why do we need developers? Can't the local government be the client, the developer?
Mm-hmm. So there's different ways that happens. Sometimes the developer already has the land. And so, you know, they're just building their housing. And if they can get a subsidy from the government in exchange for reducing the cost of the housing that they're building, then that's kind of a win-win for everyone, I guess is the idea. Why do we need developers? There are nonprofit organizations out there who are doing development. There are also private sector developers. I mean, it's sort of whoever is doing it. But the question about the local government being a client or developer is a good one. And, you know, historically that was the case. In the 1950s and 60s with public housing, a lot of that was built by local municipalities. So there is a precedent for that. I think these days municipal governments say that's not their job, but there's definitely a case that maybe it could be.
Okay, if you don't mind, Sarah, can we take just one last question from Steve because it's related to the UBI conversation?
Sure.
Economics 101 says that in order to reduce costs, you need to increase supply. If you have fixed supply and you add UBI without additional units, isn't it likely that landlords will just increase rents because tenants can afford to pay more? The same goes for price increases overall, right? And inflation in relation to the basic argument in favor of a basic income. Yeah.
It's definitely both and it's the same question with you know, the Canada Housing Benefit or any kind of subsidy or supplement that goes directly to the tenant instead of being unit based. If the market is open and there are lots of units available, then that works great. But if you're in a tight market already, giving a supplement to a household doesn't necessarily make it easier for them to find housing. And it just makes it, as you said, easier for landlords to increase the rents. So yes, definitely.
Okay, thank you so much for your REACH presentation. I hope we can do it again sometime in the future when you have more data. We know more about the housing strategy. And as we wrap up, I would like to make a couple of announcements as always. If you have a moment to share your thoughts about the webinar, or would like to suggest a speaker or a topic for future webinars, please fill out our post-webinar survey. You will find the link in Zoom's follow-up email. We will be announcing our next April webinar on our website, social media platforms, and in our newsletter as well. So do sign up. And finally, I'd like to mention that we are supported by memberships and donations. So if you would like to become a member of Humanist Canada, if you're not already a member, or contribute to our programs, including the webinar series, you can do so on our website at humanistcanada.ca. And once again, Sarah, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you all for attending, and have a good rest of your day.